This is Mark Lieberman, the host of the radio show The World According to Mark, brought to you through WPVM FM in Asheville, North Carolina, 103.7, and streaming globally on WPVMFM.org. My guest today is a gentleman I've had on the show before, very knowledgeable about all things in terms of voting rights, a lot of other things. It's Bob Phillips, Executive Director of the state affiliate of Common Cause, North Carolina. And I want to thank you very much for agreeing to stand in again, Bob.
Always good to be with you, Mark, and love the title of your show, The World According to Mark. That is, that's great. I can learn some things here.
Well, I did get some marketing advice from somebody that said that's a good name. So in any event, I'm trying not to blush, but in any event, we're here to talk about a topic that we've talked about before, but old news is new news, I guess, and this topic doesn't seem to go away. The topic is what's referred to as gerrymandering. And for those who are not familiar with what that means, although it's hard to believe if anybody's following the news these days that topic comes up often and frequently as a device that's used to basically push voting in a direction or another, usually a partisan attempt, Republican and Democrat. There are many options besides letting the state legislatures pick or decide on the maps that are used. But in the state of North Carolina, the legislature, which is in the control at this time and has been for several years of the Republicans, was tasked with the responsibility of looking at the districts. We got one more member of the House of Representatives as a result of the most recent census. So I'm going to stop talking now because as a result of that, and because you have to revise the districts every 10 years in accordance with the census, new maps came out, and those maps look very partisan to me, but that doesn't mean that they're illegal to the courts. So Bob, before you get started, tell us a little bit about what Common Cause does, what Common Cause your affiliate does, and how this whole topic becomes sort of a central and important issue.
Happy to do so, Mark. I mean, I guess what they call us sort of the originals. We're the old venerable good government organization founded way back in 1970. And no, I was not there at the beginning, although I was alive, but I've been with Common Cause North Carolina for about 20 years. And, you think about anything that has been done to promote a more inclusive democracy, that is what we are about, working on voting rights, fair maps, i.e. ending gerrymandering, curbing big money in politics, lobbying and ethics reform, and, trying to get more people from all stripes together on this. We don't think that any of those issues should be partisan, and thus the even name Common Cause, that we can find a common ground to work with each other. And so we are nonpartisan. I actually value being such. And oftentimes, as we are now in litigation over the maps, and I know we'll talk about that in just a minute, but I'm often asked, well, where were you when Democrats were doing this before 2010? Where were you then? And I can always tell them exactly where I was. I was standing with Republicans at the time who were the champions of redistricting reform, including our current Speaker, Tim Moore, and Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger, who in the minority party, they were for redistricting reform, and that's where Common Cause was. So we are nonpartisan, nonprofit, and I guess the elevator piece would be promoting more open, honest, and accountable government. So that's a mouthful as far as who we are and what we're about.
So with that preface, which was very good, and hopefully will lay the groundwork for what I want our audience to hear, is we have a situation where since the Trump administration, since the attempt to change the course of the presidential election, there have been all kinds of, there's a lot of activity about what looks to be setting up roadblocks to free and fair voting. And the Democrats in the House of Representatives in the United States has been frustrated in its attempt to pass national legislation that would correct, change, attack various things, including gerrymandering. But it would basically try to address issues of discrimination. It would address issues of voter access. It would address issues of making it easier for people to vote. There was a liberalization of voting in the last election, brought primarily, I guess, because of, or not primarily, but certainly one factor was COVID. We wanted to increase access to the polls. But since the January 6th insurrection, one of the reactions to that, and I'm not just the January 6th, January 6th insurrection, that's going to be dealt with on a separate line. But the underpinnings of that was that the last election was not fair, and that notwithstanding the popular vote, which Joe Biden won handily, notwithstanding the vote in the Electoral College, which Joe Biden had more than enough votes to be president, there Republicans and some others are saying the election was not fair, it was stolen, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what happens? Well, what has happened across the country is that state legislatures, who are really the ones for the most part that make up the rules about voting and districts and a lot of other things, have moved to change the laws to make things more tough, so to speak. They will say they're doing it to make it more fair. They will say and have said, we need to minimize the amount of fraud, and we need to rectify the so-called stop the steal. So the states have given themselves power through the state legislatures to make these changes. What we have in North Carolina and other states, I'm sure, is one of the elements that seems to be that makes people unhappy that it's not as fair as it could be, is this concept of gerrymandering. So again, long preface. How do you define gerrymandering, and how is it done here in North Carolina?
Well, I mean, there are ways to define it, but very simply, it's rigging the maps for what we would say are preordained outcomes. When you, as mentioned earlier, every 10 years after the census and with population changes and shifts in counties and cities, and we are a big state, we grew by about 1 million people, thus we did gain that 14th congressional seat, as you mentioned, but we have out of 100 counties, maybe close to half of the counties lost population. So it's a bit of a puzzle. You're having to, rule number one, make those legislative and congressional districts of equal population. The House has an ideal population, the Senate has an ideal population, and our Congress seats have an ideal population. And the way it works in North Carolina is the party in power has the power of the pen. And when the Democrats had that power pre-2010 and had the opportunity to draw the maps, they did gerrymander. And gerrymandering, again, is drawing the maps in such a way to embolden and ensure that you are not only remaining in power, but maybe, entrenching yourself. And in North Carolina, unfortunately, we probably do it, one could say, either as well or as worse as any state in America. We may be number one in gerrymandering. We have certainly, been considered one of the most gerrymandered states in America in the past. And we would say Common Cause North Carolina is a plaintiff in current litigation now against the maps. We would say that we are holding on to that mantle of being probably one of the worst states in America to gerrymander, i.e. rig legislative and congressional districts for preordained outcomes.
Okay, so what we're talking about with gerrymandering in North Carolina, it applies as well across the board, is voting districts have to be drawn up, meaning, the representatives to the Senate of the United States and representatives to, there's two senators for every state. So they don't enter the picture, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of gerrymandering. Where gerrymandering comes into play is in the House of Representatives, where you don't have two people who represent the entire state. You have individuals who represent regions, areas, districts in this case. And gerrymandering should be regarded as a bad word. I mean, it's like, to say something's gerrymandering is to say it's screwed up. But what the device is there is a way to draw the maps that games the system in favor of one political party or another. And as you say, Bob, it is used by whoever is in control of the state house in North Carolina. And in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, the governor doesn't even have a role in this. He doesn't have, under the state constitution, he doesn't have, it could be a she, but neither he nor she could make the change. It's all up to those who are presently in the state house. So even those guys who probably got there, and some women, guys and some women, got there because of the gerrymandering that put them there. Now that they're there, they have the opportunity to continue to maintain a majority, notwithstanding the actual vote count. And the way they do that, I'm going to use those two words that come up a lot, it typically is referred to as cracking and packing. So can you talk about what that means?
Sure, and we see it in both the congressional and legislative map making. And if you pack voters, and certainly there have been racial gerrymandering cases that demonstrate this more, but you would be packing African American voters in as few of districts as possible to where they win those districts big. But then you're also, on the flip side, creating more districts that the other party will win. African Americans generally, we know, vote overwhelmingly for one particular party, Democratic Party. The cracking is kind of where you're also looking at a concentration of voters and diluting the vote by spreading out that concentration of voters in multiple districts. Maybe one way, just to kind of give an example of that real quick, Mark, is the triad is an example in that congressional district. Currently, while these maps have been enacted, they are under litigation. So the current congressional district serving the triad, that's Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and High Point, it's a singular district right now, and that area has voted Democratic 5 of the last 6 presidential elections. In the enacted maps, the ones that have just been crafted, that one singular area of the state called the triad is now split up or cracked into 4 different congressional districts, not one, but 4. And you actually have, again, for folks who know North Carolina, you have Winston-Salem, High Point, and Greensboro in different congressional districts. It doesn't make really sense to anybody who lives there. That is an area that they consider themselves one community.
That's why they're called a triad. That's why they have an airport that's referred to as the Tri-City Airport or whatever. But notwithstanding that, in the infinite wisdom of whoever, or the shenanigans, it was split up, is what you're saying.
Split up into 4 congressional districts. All 4 will, and again, Common Cause is about process and not outcome, but you look at the outcome of the enacted maps, and we are a 50-50 purple state. Trump wins North Carolina by about a point. Governor Cooper wins his election by about a point. The statewide races that are not subject to gerrymandering, all of them are razor thin margins just about. And yet the enacted maps will reward about 80% of the congressional seats to one party and 60% supermajority margins in both the state house and the state senate. So you have enacted maps that aren't reflecting the true political complexion of who we are as a state, and that is purple, 50-50, evenly divided.
So they represent a complexion, but not a racial complexion or any other complexion. It's a complexion that's partisan in favor of the party in power, which in this case is the Republicans, which again, as you mentioned, not to say certainly that Democrats, when they controlled both state houses, didn't use the same techniques to push in favor of more Democrats being elected. But we're in a time period where there are so many challenges to fair voting that you would hope that perhaps folks would see the light and that there is a common cause to be had to promote free and fair elections. But that hasn't been the case. So maybe we should jump right to the lawsuit that has been going through the system, and there's a date that Common Cause has in the Supreme Court coming up, and maybe you can lay out the contours of that.
Absolutely. We did challenge the maps, and a 3-judge panel heard our claim and ruled against us. And when I say us, there were 3 plaintiff groups, Common Cause being one. Basically, Mark, as you and I were chatting beforehand, we all sort of saw and were interested that the lower court decision ruled with us in terms of the findings of the fact that the legislature had repeatedly engaged in partisan gerrymandering. They just simply landed that partisan gerrymandering is not something that is a violation of our state constitution. We certainly disagree with that finding. It runs counter to a victory we had 2 years before with another 3-judge panel. But anyway, where we are now is we lost that, immediately appealing to the North Carolina State Supreme Court, which had, by the way, jumped in and said, we're going to resolve this issue before the November 2022 election. So they told the lower court, you're going to have a 3.5-day trial, which they did. It was incredibly brief. You being an attorney, you could relate to this, Mark, that the attorneys had to work in hyperspeed and things like discovery and depositions and exhibits. And it was just a remarkable thing to see. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court said, we will be hearing this case in a very expedited fashion. So what is happening now, February 2nd, we will have our day in court. Both sides will present oral arguments. Between now and then, both sides are presenting briefs to the high court, sort of making their best argument. And soon after that February 2nd trial date, I would suspect within a week, we should hear something from the high court. And then we'll know either whether we are going to have the 2022 election with the maps that the General Assembly enacted on November 4th, or will the high court tell the General Assembly, these maps are in violation of the state constitution, you must do a redo. Or they also could say, you know what, legislature, you've proven over and over again, you are not capable of drawing fair maps. We're going to have another entity, we call it a special master, which is kind of a odd sounding name, but where this person comes and draws a neutral fair map. So obviously as a plaintiff, we are very optimistic and hopeful that the high court will invalidate the congressional and legislative maps drawn, because we feel like on multiple ways, these maps violate our state constitution.
So let's delve into that a little bit. First of all, again, before we got on the show, we discussed briefly that the United States Supreme Court recently, and on more than one occasion, has taken the position on gerrymandering that it is a quote political issue. And my response to that is, duh, yeah, it's a political issue. But that suggests that to me that they acknowledge that it's a partisan issue. But because they say it's a political issue, and because they rely on, some precedent that says the Supreme Court's not supposed to be involved in decision making that's overly political, which is, I think, sort of disingenuous to say the least, being charitable. They also seem to say, hands off. You may not like the outcome. You may not like the fact that whatever party is in power gets to make the rules and gets to draw the maps, but there's no right or wrong, meaning unless we can find something which looks like, very blatant discrimination. And what would that even look like? Discrimination on the basis of race, discrimination based on gender, discrimination on some other basis. We, the Supreme Court, feel like we should back off and leave the matter to the states. And so by leaving the matter to the states, again, in states like North Carolina, really means leave it to the state legislatures, which is, where the fox is already in the hen house, so to speak. And so the lower court, the three-judge court, as you said, and as I mentioned earlier, they seem to say, yeah, okay, it's the party in power. Yeah, they get to, decide how to draw these maps up. I mean, obviously, I'm guessing that you could come up with some kind of district where on this side of the state, we'll take a chunk, and on this side of the state, we'll take a chunk, and we'll say, even though they're separated by 200 or 300 miles, we're going to say they're in the same district. That probably wouldn't fly. But something short of that, where, you got the three cities you mentioned, the triad, they can move things around, they can move the lines and still come up with a result that, again, ensures, as you say, the outcome. And again, when you're faced with that decision, and you Common Cause and the other named plaintiffs decided to appeal, what's your next strategy? I mean, I know that a brief has been submitted. It's not public, I suppose, at this moment. But what's the strategy to say, well, the court below, was wrong about what? What were they wrong about? Were they wrong that there wasn't blatant discrimination, or are they wrong that partisanship is just sort of part of the game? Or how do you explain that, again, in simple, less legalistic terms than I might explain it?
Yeah, well, I'll do my best. I mean, I think, you think about what the democracy is supposed to be, and that is allowing for the will of the people to go forward, and to where people can come together, and what they believe and how they vote, that the will of the people matters. And when you crack, as you mentioned, what that means in packed districts and gerrymander districts in such a manner that indeed the will of the people really doesn't matter because of gerrymandering, because you have districts drawn and rigged in such a manner that, I mean, we've had in North Carolina where if you total up all the votes for the congressional races cumulatively, more voters vote for Democrats, and yet the other party that gets fewer votes has a disproportionate, like 80% share of the seats. That's the subversion of the will of the people. And that's where it violates the equal protection and the right to free assembly and free speech clauses, we feel, in our state constitution. I mean, I think whether one's a Republican or an independent or a Democrat, it would be hard to say that you are at what this lower court has said, and that is, legislature, have at it. You can gerrymander to the most extreme possible. Try to draw a congressional map that awards all 14 seats to one party if you can. And the state constitution provides, in our view, no remedy to offset that. That is not something we agree with. We are the consent of the governed, as we say, in terms of what makes our democracy and what protects a free ballot and a fair count. And when you're allowing unfettered partisan gerrymandering, and you're basically a lower court is trying to suggest that the state constitution doesn't matter, we think they got it wrong. In fact, wrong to, I believe what our attorneys are saying is a dereliction of their duty. So what the strategy is, I mean, I know it's limited, but we are going to the high court and we are saying, fix this. Well, I mean, we're saying it in more legal words than that, but that is, they're wrong. This needs to be invalidated and new maps need to be drawn. I regret that we are in this cycle of always having to do this, having to run to the courts to seek relief. The real strategy and the real answer is to get something better, a better process, and it does exist in other states. And first and foremost, and again, we could talk about this for a long time, but I'll just say, first and foremost, you have to get the map making out of the hands of the legislators themselves. You mentioned the fox guarding the hen house. Lawmakers have no business drawing their own districts, period. Any Republican or Democratic or independent voter, I think, can easily understand that. It's about fairness. Get it out of their hands. And this is what a couple of other states have done successfully, and that is let an independent commission of citizens that include everybody, Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliated voters, let them do it. It is working in other states, and that is what we want. And that's kind of our strategy, to keep pushing for reform in that manner.
So let's talk about that a bit. Again, I've had other shows where we talked about alternative ways in which districts could be drawn up. And one of them is, as you indicated, is take it out of the hands of the state legislature, which is obviously by definition, one actually would have to agree, partisan, and put it in the hands of a nonpartisan independent commission. There are some states that have done that, although those states are in the minority, I believe. You don't have enough doing that, and it's not being done in North Carolina. So let me go back to the point you made. Is apparently there is nothing in the state constitution of North Carolina that speaks specifically or explicitly to the issue of how far you can go in terms of these gerrymandering activities. Nothing that says, this you can't do it this way, you can only do it that way. You can't, there's no rules because it's just not there. So the Constitution sort of goes against what you're attempting to do in fighting the gerrymandering that's going on here. Is that a fair statement?
It doesn't speak directly to anything regarding how maps are drawn, but again, we have something like the Free Elections Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. And again, equal protection, equal voting, those clauses are actually stronger in our state constitution than they are in the federal constitution. And people may think, well, wait a minute, we all can vote, so isn't that equal? Well, no, when you think about if you're packed into a district, and maybe you're packed into a district where the majority of the voters are of one way and you're in the other, that means your vote really doesn't matter. Or even if it's with the majority of voters, we want every vote to really be equal and to where it can sway a political outcome. And when a legislature strategically and deliberately and intentionally engages in gerrymandering and also engages in racial discrimination intent to do that, because that's what we feel like they've done this time, that is violating the Equal Protection Clause, we feel, in our state constitution, because it's diluting one's vote. You're either cracked where your vote doesn't matter, or you're either packed or where your vote doesn't matter. And that's what's done all across the state in our legislative and congressional districts.
We're talking with Bob Phillips, the executive director of the state affiliate of Common Cause in North Carolina, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advocates for, among other things, free and fair elections and justice issues surrounding that. And we're talking about the state of the state that we're in, which is census was completed towards the end of last year. Every 10 years, North Carolina got an extra district that allowed or required there to be a redrawing of the districts. The districts were redrawn, and even the lower court and presumably the Republicans wouldn't disagree. They were redrawn in a way that benefits the Republican Party, which and disadvantages the Democratic Party, which is the only two parties we really have operating in North Carolina in the country as a whole. And we know that that has racial and other elements of it, which are seemingly unfair. And again, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but it seemed like the lower court and the Supreme Court, when they had an opportunity to weigh in, they're acknowledging that even though the result may be unfair or disagreeable or not what it should be, those so-called equitable principles is what lawyers use those words. Even though we don't like it, even though we think it's distasteful, even though we think it's wrong, we are powerless. We lack the skills to change it, which means, okay, so the court's not going to intervene. So what's left? Well, the governor doesn't have a voice in North Carolina, so it's up to the state legislature. Well, how do you get the state legislature to act in accordance with these rules of equity and fairness? Well, it's the voters. But if the voters' strength to advocate these ideas are diluted because of the cracking and packing of gerrymandering, then it'll never get it done. So it's a complete circle. It's just a complete do loop, I guess, to say. And there's no hope, because what would change this is if, besides a court ruling in the way that you wish it would, Common Cause wishes it would rule, if the state legislature said, you know what, maybe we should do something. Maybe we should have some rules about how you create the districts, because there may come a day, despite radical gerrymandering, that the Republicans will no longer hold the majority in the state house. I don't know how that would occur, but there may come a day. And so why don't we prepare for that and write some rules so that the outcomes can't preordain just because of the way the maps are drawn. So I don't know, where do you stand on it? Where does Common Cause stand on making legislative changes? Is that just not really on the agenda and you just got to fight the fight that you have in court right now?
Well, I could jokingly say, Mark, and you did sum it up well, to say I've removed all sharp objects from my reach. Because, unfortunately, we do have our backs against the wall in North Carolina, because we do have a state where, as you've mentioned, the governor has no ability to veto what the legislature does. And that's a big impediment there. And the Democrats were the ones that kind of made that deal when they allowed or pushed the legislation, the constitutional, I should say, amendment that gave the governor the veto. Part of the deal was that the governor would not be able to veto matters of redistricting. So that's off the table. And indeed, when a court says, hey, if people don't like this gerrymandering we have, vote them out, vote the rascals out. Well, like you just said, how do you do that when one, the maps are rigged in such a way that the people are pretty much protected? Many of the congressional and legislative races are absolutely not even competitive because of gerrymandering. It's not the political geography as much as the way those maps are drawn. And the lower court agreed with us on that. And, by the way, Asheville, Buncombe County, for anyone that pays attention to this stuff, that is one of those districts that is under litigation, where the three members of the state house in Buncombe County had been Democratic. And again, I'm saying this in a neutral, nonpartisan voice, but what the enacted maps that were just approved last month, what they've done is they've made two of the three districts even bluer, packing in more Democratic voters to make the third district that had been Democratic. And by the way, it was a Brian Turner seat, for anyone on any of your listeners and viewers who would know who he is. But they flipped that. They've made that a Republican district. I haven't talked to Representative Turner, but he is not running for re-election, as many of your viewers and listeners may know. But getting back to kind of then, well, what the heck do we do? Because, the folks who really can have the say, and I'll mention this too, you have to have super majorities in both chambers to get anything on the ballot. Well, if you're in power and you've gerrymandered the maps, why in the world are you going to, pass something to put it up before the people of North Carolina? Yet I will say, poll after poll after poll shows that people want this. They want a fair process. Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliated alike get it. If you have the time to explain it to them, they understand from a sense of fairness that we shouldn't have a democracy where the legislative and congressional maps are rigged to such that one party is entrenched in power. So it is still our quest and our obligation as one of these do-gooders out here, and I sometimes jokingly say tilting at windmills, but to keep pushing and keep educating. Candidly, the business community really, I wished, would get more on board with this. Some people may remember when HB2, the so-called bathroom bill, was passed several years ago by a legislature, a legislature that was the product of gerrymandering, extreme gerrymandering. And overwhelmingly, most of the people who voted for this HB2, the bathroom bill, if people may or may not remember it, 90% of the people who voted for it were in districts where they either had no competition in the election before that vote was taken, or they had won their seat by 10 points or more, virtually no competition. So they pay no price, and they can pass extreme legislation like that. What flipped it and reversed it was the reaction from the business community. And when you have the Apples and the IBMs and name your favorite big business that wants to either expand in North Carolina or come to this state, and they see that happening, and they say, you know what, we're out. We're not going to come here. That's what changed things. And so again, this to me is a bigger story of what kind of North Carolina do we want to be as we progress, into the 21st century. And we are a very diverse state. I know in the West, it's not as racially diverse as perhaps it is in other parts of the state, but we are a fantastically diverse state, and we are a modern, growing, fast-growing state. And do we want to be locked into this gerrymandering process that is distorting who gets elected and then having an impact on passing very ideologically driven legislation? And is that something good for business? I don't think it is. I don't think it reflects, again, who we are. And I think it's incumbent upon organizations like Common Cause to continue to educate and appeal to everybody. But I mentioned the business class or business community, if you will, as being an entity or a cohort that needs to come to the table. We want them there. Anyway, I got on my soapbox a bit, but maybe that.
No, I think that's important. I mean, let me sort of weigh in a little bit and explore it a little bit more. You say it would be good if the business community would weigh in, and the reason I'm assuming you're saying that is because the business community has a way of leveraging, because people can be partisan, but the legislators have a constituency of individuals who want to be employed. They want to have reasonable wages. They want good schools, although North Carolina is not doing so well in terms of what it's paying teachers and so on and so forth. They want reasonable health care, although North Carolina is not being very good about that because we can't expand Medicaid, which most Democrats would be in favor of. And I think, frankly, the polls suggest most people generally would be in favor of. So when you indicate, and I would agree that the partisan gerrymandering and the gerrymandering that results in what seem on their face to be unjust results, and as I said, even the court seems to acknowledge that, but nobody's paying a price. I guess it's part of sort of the polarization that we're seeing across the country, which is if you're a Republican, then you don't you don't really care about much more than to say, I'm a Republican and I'm okay with there being more Republicans in the state house than there are Democrats, even though the state is almost evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. I'm in favor of that. And when you're in favor of that, then these other issues, which people ought to be looking at, don't get aired. I mean, it's not a true statement to say corporations don't care about fair and just results, but corporations care about making money. They care about having employees to do the work. And this is an issue which I think is abstract in the minds of a lot of people. And I mean, gerrymandering, that was a salamander. It had claws. It looks ugly. The whole very concept of it seems repugnant and repellent, and yet it's being done. And I think it's because it is actually it seems to be more complicated than it really is. I mean, if you just ask the question, like, for example, Bob, let me ask, what is the balance of Democrats and Republicans in the two state houses in North Carolina? There are approximately how many Republicans versus Democrats? I apologize for popping that question. You may not know the answer offhand, but
no, again, I should remember exactly. We have 120 members of the state house and 50 state Senate members, and both the Republicans have just under super majorities in the Senate. I believe it's a 29-21, and in the House, I believe it's 67-53, something about like that. So it has been greater. Last decade, the Republican Party had super majorities, and the enacted maps. Just again, I think I said 80% congressional and 60% for both chambers, but I'll go with the congressional map. We have 14 congressional seats right now. Again, we are a state that's 50-50, and all the analysis of the enacted congressional map suggests that it would be a 10-4 or 11-3 congressional map, and that's just a distortion of reflecting, what the true political balance of North Carolina is.
So the very concept that is articulated a lot, but seems to be empty, of one person, one vote, when you have 14 representatives that will be elected, but as many as 10 or 11 are going to be Republican because that's the way the districts were carved up. Again, it seems on its face to call for some reaction, and that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, we would say the same thing if the maps were showing Democrats, if they had drawn the maps and having the same advantage. What we showed in our trial through algorithms and mathematicians who took in an algorithm that had nonpartisan data in it, and the criteria that the legislature used, with the exception of pure nonpartisan data, trillions of maps run, and everybody kind of landed at the same place, and that is that the enacted maps were that 99.999% of all the maps that this algorithm created, and that's of trillions, were less partisan or less gerrymandered than the one singular map that lawmakers landed on in the state house, state senate, and congressional map. And kind of getting back to the business piece too, just one other thing I was going to say, in this polarized world we live in, and it is true, but where you see people come together is, and I'll give the example of about a month ago when Toyota came to North Carolina to trumpet a 1.3 billion, that's with a B, dollar investment in the Triad. I think they're going to make batteries for the cars there, I believe. Well, you had the governor and the Republican state leadership all there on the same podium, all smiles and handshakes and what have you. We are united, I think, in some places to want to provide growth and a bright future to North Carolina. And I'm just trying to suggest that this horrible process that we have here in this state that distorts our elections, and then leads to, I think, a lot of bad policy, a lot of bad policy. And again, you could say that on both sides, I guess, depending. I mean, it's not healthy when there's one party in power. Um, and that's where I really do think the business community should have a voice. I'm not suggesting I know whether Toyota would dare wade into this, but if they said, you know what, we're out, we don't like what we see in the triad, this is a singular regional area, and you've sliced this area now into 4 congressional districts, we're done. I would suspect that could create some reaction with the legislature. And if businesses pressed hard enough, it may even press them to make some reforms. And I'm not trying to sound naive about that, but that's just one pressure point we'd love to be able to have in our arsenal.
Well, um, I think I think the point that you made is very valid and very important. I think that what needs to happen is that you need to sort of connect these issues. I'm saying that gerrymandering and packing and cracking and who gets to decide, that it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. It's not, it doesn't lead to just results from a common sense standpoint. And I don't think anybody really can argue against that. What they're saying and what the courts are saying and what the Republicans who are doing this are saying, I'm sorry, that's just the spoils of victory. We won and we get to make the rules. It's the same thing that they say when, you know, they decide we're going to put a very partisan person on the Supreme Court of the United States. We're in charge. We're gonna make the rules. But the issues, it seems, as you're alluding to, that need to be addressed is, okay, knowing that the state is gerrymandering, meaning knowing that you have a pretty close to a 50-50 split of Democrats and Republican voters in the state of North Carolina, but the legislature is highly leveraged by Republicans. That ends up meaning that these kinds of laws that people care about are probably not going to be passed. So you're not, if you had a Democratic majority in the state house in North Carolina, I'm not saying I'm not going to weigh in on it one way or the other, but I bet you would have Medicaid expansion. You would have had it, you know, years ago. I bet you that if there was a Democratic majority, you would have ways you would have legislation that would increase pay to teachers and would help support public schools and not, you know, relegate education to, you know, homeschooling and lots of things that have political overtones, because we know we know how the votes are usually counted on those things. So I think that if there is going to be a reaction that changes things, first and foremost, it has to start with the electorate. They have to understand the consequences of having a stagnation and stagnant partisan divide in the state house, and how that looks to corporations that have a choice of either locating here or locating somewhere else. But that's a pretty hard case to make, and it's probably not one that Common Cause can make very well. Is that a fair statement?
It is a fair statement in that we're not invited into the boardrooms of the corporations, and I don't have the numbers of the CEOs, but there are other people that do and can, and that's one of the things we continue to try to, again, push. I mean, one of the things too about when we talk about the diversity of North Carolina, about 10 million people plus, and we're the 9th largest state, just behind Georgia in America, growing about 1 million people in the last decade, and 40% of our state is non-white. 40%. That would include Asian, Native American, Hispanic, and African American. 40%. Yet the enacted maps are going to result in fewer people of color representing North Carolina in both the legislature and Congress. Something's wrong with that picture, Mark. I mean, that is just not right. And I don't think that's necessarily a fact that's going to be lost on corporate America, or it should not be lost on corporate America, when particularly in the last 2 years we've had in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, and the Black Lives Matters movement that corporations are more sensitive than ever to issues of race equity. And what, again, are you coming to when you have a state that is one of the most diverse states in America and looks a lot like what we are as a country, and yet you have, and let's call it what it is, racist maps that were drawn by white Republicans. And I'm not trying to say that in a horrible manner, it's just facts that are creating fewer people of color who are representing the state of North Carolina. That's wrong. And we hope the High Court recognizes that. And we hope that since we can't get the relief in the legislature as easily as we'd like, that again, we can get the attention of that voice that does matter. I know I wasn't necessarily thinking I would talk a lot about the business community when we were chatting about doing this interview, Mark, but I guess that's just kind of where I've landed. But that's, that is a big piece of it, we think.
Well, let's get back over to the judicial side. This case, again, is going to be heard by the highest court in the state. If the outcome is not favorable to redraw these maps, is that the end of the road? Is there a path forward to the Supreme Court? But before we get big, I want to do it in order. What do you think is the likely outcome? And we talked about this before we went on there. We don't like to think of our justices as being partisan, but they are. And you have a majority, I guess, of the justices on the state Supreme Court in North Carolina as Democrats. Do you expect that will give a more favorable possibility or possibility of a favorable outcome to reject the redistricting maps that were presented by the Republican dominated legislature?
Well, again, you hope and don't want to think that the merits of the case really are not so much important, but it's more of what the partisan divide of the court is. I would take, from a reform standpoint right now, the very legislation that the party that our three Republican justices belong to, what they once pushed and what Senator Berger and at the time Representative Tim Moore, I would take their proposal that they sponsored back in 2009 right now. And so I guess I would hope that maybe these partisan Republican justices and partisan Democratic justices would look at, again, where we have been as a state in North Carolina and where their political parties have been as well. And knowing that gerrymandering is wrong and that here, this state Supreme Court has the first opportunity ever. We've never had a partisan gerrymandering case come before the state Supreme Court, has an opportunity to rule in a precedent-setting case. So I guess I'm optimistic, and it's not because, it's 4 Democrats to 3 Republicans. I really do think we have a very, very strong case. And a lot of people have kind of wondered, did the lower court land where they landed because they want to say, we're teeing it up for this high court to make the call, and we think that we just aren't at this superior court, really the court to say partisan gerrymandering is a violation of the state constitution. It should come from the appellate court. Or are they kind of daring the Supreme Court to, go against them? I'm hoping it's the former. I hope that this is all set up for the state Supreme Court to, what we would think, make the right call, invalidate the maps, and hopefully set some standards. And, that will help now. But again, I know I'm going beyond answering the question you asked, but beyond that, still talking about the need for a legislative solution, reform, and figuring out ways of pressuring the folks in power to do the right thing.
No, well, I think that is the right question. I think that it's very possible, who can tell, we can't get in the heads of the justices, that the lower court said, this is something we're going to continue to duck because we think it's a political issue. The Supreme Court of the United States has sort of ducked it. Who are we to be, out there on a limb by ourselves, dictating what needs to be done when gerrymandering people seem to take it as a given, even though it's not a good given. So they could be saying that. But if the outcome had been different at the lower court, this would have ended up in the Supreme Court anyhow, correct? I mean,
great question, because 2 years ago when we won, the majority party chose to just leave it and keep it there because they kind of felt like they might have a better deal, I guess, with the lower court and not take a chance at the Supreme Court, which at the time, by the way, was 6 Democrats to 1 Republican. And I guess they didn't want to risk losing there. So, I don't know. That's a great question. I think that probably had we won, we would not have appealed. Obviously, we wouldn't appeal anyway, but had we won, would the majority party, they would have been in the same situation that they were 2 years ago when they did not appeal. And so that's kind of one of those questions that we really don't know. But one aspect too, Mark, I wanted to really quickly mention that we hadn't talked about, and I'll just mention it real quickly, that also is something that the high court has to consider, is what came out in the lower court in trial about these secret maps that had been crafted. The majority party boasted about this being the most transparent process ever, and that there was not going to be any consideration of racial and partisan data. And that was a lie. That was not true, because there were secret maps that had partisan and racial data, no doubt, as a part of how these maps were constructed. And no one knew about them until it came out in court. We actually learned about it in deposition. And when we asked to see the maps, we were told, oh no, they've been destroyed or lost. So no telling where they are. That's something that the high court will have to also take into consideration as they look at, this case, along with the Voting Rights Act. That's the other big piece of it, where you have to, by the state constitution, draw your VRA districts first before you draw your non-VRA districts. And what a VRA district is where you have a concentration of minority voters. And by law, you must draw districts that give these minority voters an opportunity to elect someone of their choice. This legislature didn't even do that. They didn't look at racial data to draw any VRA districts. That is a violation of the state constitution in our view. And we think the high court, there is no way they can ignore that. So again, I know 2 other things that I should have brought up earlier, but just to say why we think we are in a good position to win this case.
Okay, well, we have just a couple of minutes left. We've been talking to Bob Phillips, the executive director of the state affiliate of Common Cause, about gerrymandering, and we've touched on other areas of voting issues. But, North Carolina doesn't sit there on its own. We've got other issues. We've got the filibuster, which creates gridlock in Congress. We've got, issues of separation of power and veto rights, and so on and so forth. We have voting changes across the country of limiting the ability of people to come to vote in the first place. So this democracy has a lot of very strong challenges. And I guess Common Cause is a good reason to have some optimism that perhaps things can change. And I want to thank you for being on the show and give you a chance to just one or two quick parting thoughts before we go off air.
Well, as always, Mark, it's great to be with you, and I appreciate the chance to talk about this in such an in-depth way. But I would just say, folks who are interested in this and care about it and know about it, one, they can always contact us at commoncauseinc.org. But also, it's always a good thing for folks who represent you to let them hear from you, and to, if you are interested in the issue, to, even though I know this is not cocktail party conversation, but to where you can talk to your networks, friends and family about it. And we want to make this a campaign issue. Everybody who runs for the legislature and Congress in 2022, every single seat in the North Carolina General Assembly and every congressional seat representing North Carolina in the U.S. House is up for grabs. Every candidate should be asked, where do you stand on this? What do you think about it? And if you don't like reform, tell us why. So I would just ask people to stay engaged, and thank you again for your attention and interest in this issue.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for being on the show.